Welcome to True Tears Stories. Please like this video and subscribe to True Tears Stories. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. Martin hadn't meant to cry. Not there. Not like that. It was supposed to be a simple moment. Just papers, signatures, polite nods over a cherrywood table in a downtown mediation office that smelled faintly of artificial citrus and old carpet. Elise sat across from him, immaculate in her pressed cream blouse, legs crossed elegantly, as if she were waiting for tea, not the division of an entire life. The mediator had asked a question, something procedural, something that shouldn't have had weight. Is there any emotional or financial consideration still in dispute? Martin had opened his mouth to answer, but instead something caught. Not in his throat, in his chest. A pressure that had been building for months, maybe years, and suddenly the dam cracked. His eyes stung, his jaw tightened, and before he could stop it, he exhaled a small, unsteady breath that dragged a tear down his cheek. He hadn't even wiped it away yet when she laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Just a soft exhale through her nose, accompanied by the hint of a smirk. Dismissive. Disbelieving. Really? She said under her breath, still smiling. The mediator looked down, suddenly very interested in his notes. Martin blinked hard and straightened in his chair. The heat that rose in his face wasn't just from shame. It was recognition. Not the first time he'd seen that look on her. He thought back to the night his mother died. When he got the call, Elise had asked if the funeral could be scheduled around her cousin's destination wedding. "It's just that I've already RSVP'd," she'd said, barefoot and holding a glass of red wine. He should have known then. But you don't always see betrayal as betrayal when it wears pearls and speaks gently. He didn't speak after that, not for the rest of the session. As they walked out, Elise turned to him in the hallway. "You're being overly emotional. It doesn't suit you." He looked at her, really looked. Her expression was perfectly composed, as always. The kind of beauty that was admired at dinner parties, envied at charity events. She knew how to smile without meaning it, knew how to nod without agreeing. Martin had spent years deciphering her, years softening his voice so she wouldn't claim he was too intense, years lowering himself so she could feel taller. But now, in the sterile hallway of a third-floor legal office, he realized something simple and devastating. She had never really known him, not truly, and soon she would, because Martin hadn't come to the table empty-handed. She thought she knew everything, thought the divorce was just a formality. She had the better lawyer, the cleaner story. She believed she had all the leverage. His job loss, his quiet withdrawal from their social life, his growing silences. She thought it made her the strong one, the sane one, but she didn't know the whole story. She didn't know what he'd found. Martin stepped outside into the chilled air. The city moved around him, fast and indifferent. Traffic blurred past in streaks of sound. He tucked his hands in his coat pockets, fingers brushing the USB drive. Small, unassuming, but filled with documents, messages, timestamps, proof. He hadn't planned to use it at first, but the laugh, that single cruel exhale, changed something in him. She hadn't just fallen out of love with him. She had stopped respecting him. And if she thought the courtroom would be her stage, she had forgotten one thing. He had a story, too, and it was time someone heard it. Martin didn't go straight home. He walked, past the courthouse, past the pharmacy on the corner where Elise used to send him for her special skincare serums, past the bakery they never went to because she was trying to cut gluten. The city had never felt quite his. Their apartment, her friends, their calendar. It had always been her version of life with his name penciled into the margins. That laugh had pulled the thread loose, but the unraveling had started long before. Years ago, he'd tried to tell her about the promotion he turned down, how the long hours were grinding him down, how he wanted something quieter, something with purpose. She'd sipped her wine and said, "Well, someone has to keep us living in this zip code," like money was the only currency she trusted. And maybe it was. Elise didn't like messy things. She had a way of smiling tightly when someone cried at weddings. She organized emotions the way she organized closets behind closed doors, neatly labeled, never too full. But Martin wasn't neat. He had feelings that spilled and questions that didn't have answers. He liked silence, but not coldness. He thought marriage was supposed to be a shelter, not a performance. The first time he suspected she was hiding something, it wasn't even about another person. It was about an account, an investment she didn't tell him about. He'd found the email by accident while printing a document for their tax appointment. She dismissed it easily. "Oh, that? It's just something my father helped me set up. I didn't think it mattered." He had believed her until the second email and the third. Then came the messages. Late-night chats with a coworker. Then photos from a conference she never mentioned attending. All casually explained. All technically plausible. Martin didn't confront her. He watched, observed, quietly documented. Not because he wanted revenge, but because something in him had cracked, and he needed to understand what had broken. And then there was the biggest crack of all, her family. Elise's parents had always been polite to him, polished, generous, and quietly patronizing. Her mother once called him a solid choice, as if she were reviewing an appliance. Her father, a former judge, made a habit of steering conversations toward case law and finance, always with the unspoken suggestion that Martin wasn't quite cut from the same cloth. They smiled at him, yes, but it was the smile you give the help, appreciative but detached. He never fit, and Elise never tried to help him fit. When her brother got engaged, Martin offered to co-plan the engagement party. Elise had laughed. "Let's leave that to the real hosts, Real hosts. Even in their own marriage, Martin felt like a guest. Still, he stayed. Because he believed in vows. Because he thought love wasn't supposed to be easy. Because he hoped, naively, that effort could build what chemistry couldn't. And then the effort became exhaustion. He thought maybe things would change when he got laid off. That maybe she'd see him, finally, as vulnerable, human. But she didn't. She tightened her grip on the purchase strings, rationed her kindness like it came with a receipt. When he cried after the layoff, not sobbing, just quietly breaking, she asked if he could go to the other room, because it was making her uncomfortable. He had curled up on the floor that night, alone. Now, in the cold light of their separation, she sat smug in mediation, assuming he'd leave quietly, that he'd be too ashamed to speak up. But shame is a strange thing. It only works when it's hidden. And Martin was done hiding. He stopped walking when he reached the bench near the dog park, the one where he used to sit on Sunday mornings with coffee, pretending to read while he watched strangers play with their pets. That had always soothed him, watching people who didn't know they were being seen. He pulled out his phone and opened the secure folder. The messages were still there. The digital breadcrumbs of a double life, Elise's investment accounts, her travel receipts, a duplicate apartment lease in a neighboring city under her maiden name, and worst of all, a signed affidavit from her own assistant quietly given to Martin 2 weeks ago after a hesitant lunch meeting. He hadn't asked for it. The assistant offered it. "She always acted like you didn't notice things," she had said. "I just thought, maybe you should know you're not crazy." Martin wasn't angry. He wasn't even sad anymore. He felt clear. Clear enough to realize that Elise had never really expected consequences. She had built her image so carefully, always composed, always justified. Even when she lied, it sounded logical. But logic couldn't save her from evidence. And now, with the court date approaching, Martin wasn't preparing for a fight. He was preparing for release. Let her find out who he really was, in court. Not the man who cried, the man who finally stopped apologizing. The courtroom was smaller than Martin expected. Not the grand, echoing space from legal dramas, but a modest room with stiff chairs, dull lighting, and a quiet hum of tension hanging in the air like dust. The kind of place where things ended, not in fury, but in paperwork. Elise sat to his left, perfectly poised, dressed in muted tones that said reasonable and gracious. She wore a look of faint boredom, like the entire affair was beneath her, but she was here for appearance's sake. She barely glanced at him as she adjusted her blazer's sleeve and whispered something to her attorney, a confident woman with tightly coiled hair and a silver pen. Martin sat with his hands folded loosely in his lap. His attorney, young, calm, and sharper than he looked, tapped his pen gently against the table, then slid a file toward Martin without a word. It was time. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The formalities passed in a blur. Then it began. Elise's attorney opened with her statement, measured, carefully crafted, brimming with amicable intentions and regretful incompatibility. She spoke of Martin's instability, his emotional unpredictability after the job loss, and how Elise had graciously attempted to support him, only to find herself bearing the burden alone. Martin watched Elise as the words painted a portrait of him he barely recognized. Fragile, irrational, unmotivated. Elise nodded along as her lawyer spoke, her eyes darting occasionally toward the judge, managing the performance like a seasoned conductor. Then came his turn. Martin's attorney stood, quiet, calm, unshaken. "Your Honor," he began, "what my client wishes to present is not an argument of emotion, but one of clarity." Martin looked down as the file was opened. Evidence, neatly organized, emails, transactions, travel records, testimonies, not opinion, facts. The courtroom shifted. Elise finally looked at him, really looked. Her forehead tensed. The easy confidence in her shoulders tightened, barely, but enough for Martin to see it. It was subtle, the slow dismantling of her mask. His attorney continued. "While Mrs. Langford has accused Mr. Langford of emotional instability, We will be presenting documentation indicating a long-standing pattern of deception. This includes financial concealment, extramarital involvement, and undisclosed property under her alternate surname. Martin didn't turn toward Elise. He didn't need to. He could feel her unraveling beside him. Her attorney tried to object. Too vague. They said, irrelevant to the financial proceedings. But the judge allowed it. Not for punishment. Martin hadn't asked for that. But for the sake of truth. For balance. For record. One by one, the documents were introduced. Not dramatic, just undeniable. The lease for the apartment, the emails marked with timestamps sent during work trips, the affidavit from her assistant, discreetly confirming Elise's repeated overnight absences and instructions to forward mail to an unknown address. Elise's voice finally broke through, a low hiss to her attorney. Then louder, "This is completely out of context. He's twisting everything." But the courtroom didn't shift to her anymore. The center had moved. Martin hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't asked for vengeance. But in that still, echoless room, everything Elise thought she controlled began slipping through her fingers. He glanced over, once. Her face was still composed, barely, but her hands betrayed her, fingers tugging at her sleeve, adjusting her necklace, searching for control. And he realized, in that moment, she wasn't angry. She was surprised. Surprised that he had the resolve, the restraint, the proof. Because she had never truly seen him. Not as someone who noticed, who remembered, who gathered the threads in silence until he could finally weave them into something undeniable. The judge listened carefully. The attorneys traded quiet remarks. The rest of the session passed in a fog. Legal terms, financial percentages, asset division. But it didn't matter. The narrative had shifted, not in cruelty, not in scandal, in truth. Martin left the courtroom without rushing. He didn't glance back. He didn't need to. Elise would have her explanations, her spin, her tightly wound justifications. But the difference now? They didn't matter. He hadn't come to win. He had come to reclaim his voice, his name, his peace. Outside, the sky had darkened. The air was cool, the wind brushing gently against his collar. Martin inhaled deeply. For the first time in years, it didn't catch in his throat. The final hearing was brief. Just signatures, confirmations, nods from the court clerk. There were no closing arguments, no final jabs. Everything necessary had already been said, and everything else, well, it no longer needed to be. Martin stood quietly beside his attorney as Elise recited her name, her date of birth, her agreement to the terms. Her voice was calm, but brittle now, like glass already cracked down the middle. She didn't look at him once. Not since the last hearing. And that was fine, because Martin no longer needed anything from her. Outside, Elise's parents waited by their car. Her mother wore a navy coat, and that familiar expression of disappointment softened into politeness. Her father didn't even nod. Elise walked to them with short, sharp steps, heels clicking like punctuation. Martin watched them pile into the sedan and pull away, a perfect portrait of detachment. He didn't wave. Instead, he turned toward the steps and made his way down slowly, one hand trailing the cool iron railing. It felt symbolic somehow, descending, not defeated, but released. At the sidewalk, his attorney offered a tight handshake and a quiet, "You handled this. with more grace than most. Martin thanked him, meant it, and then walked away alone. The city hadn't changed. The buses still ran. Someone was laughing on a park bench. A pigeon pecked at the crumbs near a newsstand. Life didn't stop for endings. It just kept going, quietly asking what came next. Martin stopped at a small cafe, one of those quiet places tucked between a dry cleaner and a florist. He had passed it dozens of times during his marriage and never stepped inside. Elise had her preferred spots, and Martin had learned, slowly, not to choose against her preferences. Not worth the size, the strategic silence, the subtle way she made him feel uncultured for liking simpler things. But now he ordered a cappuccino, sat at a window table, and pulled out a book he had started months ago. No one rushed him. No one interrupted. He sipped slowly, feeling something strange and unfamiliar settle into his chest. It wasn't joy, not yet. But it was peaceful, the quiet absence of weight. He thought of Elise then, not with anger, not even sadness, just a distant kind of curiosity. What version of their story would she be telling now? How would she explain the shift? Would she say he blindsided her, painted her unfairly? Maybe. Probably. It didn't matter. He hadn't exposed her out of spite. He hadn't needed her to break down or beg. All he needed was for her to see him, if only for a moment, as the man she never bothered to understand. And maybe she had. Maybe that moment in court, when the photos and documents appeared, when her voice cracked just slightly, that was the moment. Not dramatic, just real. He wouldn't know for sure. That was no longer his story to follow. The server refilled his water glass and smiled. Need anything else? Martin returned the smile. No, I'm good, really. He meant it. There would still be echoes of her, her voice in old voicemails, her handwriting on files he hadn't yet cleared, the occasional awkward run-in at events they used to attend as a couple. But none of it could touch him anymore, because now he knew who he was outside of her story. He had cried once, and she had laughed. But the man who had cried was still healing. And the man who had walked into court and told the truth, that man had finally arrived. The days after the divorce weren't filled with fireworks or grand revelations. There were no dramatic changes, no impulse decisions, just small, quiet choices. Martin started waking up earlier. He began walking without a destination. He cleared the apartment of the things that no longer made sense. The set of crystal glasses they never used, the unread design magazines, the throw pillows she insisted were just for decoration. And in their place, he brought in softness, books that spoke to him, photos of places he'd always wanted to visit, but had shelved for some other time, mismatched mugs that felt like him. The life he built afterward wasn't loud or impressive, but it was his, fully his. Sometimes he thought about love, not with yearning, but with wonder. What it might look like to be known without being managed, to be loved not for presentation, but for presence. He wasn't chasing that just yet, but he wasn't afraid of it anymore. When people asked what happened, he didn't give details. He just said it was time, and that was enough. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to win an argument or prove someone wrong. It's to walk away knowing you told the truth, and you didn't need anyone's permission to finally be yourself.